Mark Kimmitt. He is former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, and Matthew Bryza, former U.S. Ambassador to Azerbaijan. Thanks both so much for being with us. I failed to mention in that introduction, of course, the relationship with Turkey, key as well to the relationship with the entire region. There are certain things, let's just say this, that Turkey does appreciate about Trump's foreign policy, not least his stand, intentional or not, on Turkey's role in Syria, in contrast to where Democrats stand supporting YPG forces. Trump has said the right things about Turkey's purchasing the S-400s, but, Mark, Turkey is very principled on issues of Islamophobia, for example, and looking at the Trump administration, including the Muslim travel ban. Is it hard for Ankara to really throw its weight behind a Trump administration going forward?
Well, I think most of the issues and difficulties that the president had with his view of the Muslim world were at the beginning of his administration. I think the more he settled into the job, the less he was as verbal and vocal about Muslimophobia, so to speak. He seems to have settled now on phobia against China rather than against the Muslim world. His trips to Saudi Arabia, his trips to other countries in the region, I think have sobered him and settled him down a bit, even though, as well, the squad that constantly berates him inside the United States House of Representatives, who all have a background in the Middle East. But I certainly hope that he has become far more circumspect about the issue than, say, perhaps French President Macron. So let's just hope that if there is a second Trump term, that he will continue this improvement in his view and his understanding of Islam and how it affects the region.
Okay. Matthew Bryza, are you on the same page there?
Yeah, more or less. And it's great to be with you, by the way, Andrea, and with General Kimmitt. It's really fun to be on the show. I am. I think that the President Trump has moderated a lot of his rhetoric with regard to foreign policy as his administration continued. I think, I was shocked, however, at the beginning when he called into question the utility of NATO and was saying it was obsolete. He stopped doing that. Thank goodness. And when it comes to Turkey, just focused on Turkey for a moment, I mean, he has been probably the strongest proponent in his administration of good relations with Turkey. Turkey is seen as sort of almost a toxic brand around much of Washington in terms of foreign policy, with people not really understanding what's happening on the ground in the Eastern Mediterranean disputes and how complex they are. But it's President Trump who sort of single-handedly prevented or refused to impose sanctions against Turkey, as the U.S. Congress has required him to do under the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act for Turkey's purchase of the Russian S-400 air defense system. So I think that the road will be smoother initially in U.S.-Turkey relations in a second Trump term than if Vice President Biden were to be elected.
Okay, Matthew, I'm going to stick with you because, it's not the Middle East. Technically, it's the Caucasus, but still very important to Turkey, and that is, of course, the war in Nagorno-Karabakh. The United States, was a leader in the Minsk group, as you well know. You were one of the negotiators, but we haven't heard a lot out of the United States, except for example, the mayor of Los Angeles, who many argue for very political reasons took a strong stance for Armenia on the issue. But do you think the U.S. will have a voice post this election on that conflict? Because it is so important, not just for Turkey, but for a relationship as well with Russia and Central Asia.
I sure hope so. I mean, I was really happy that Secretary Pompeo hosted the foreign ministers of Armenia and Azerbaijan a couple of weeks ago, and at least, got them to agree to a ceasefire that didn't last more than a few minutes, but nonetheless got them to agree. I was pleased that at that time, National Security Advisor O'Brien issued a statement or made a statement in which he said that he calls on the parties to return to negotiations based on the so-called basic principles, which is a framework for a peace deal that was agreed preliminarily by Armenia and Azerbaijan 11 years ago. For years, I've thought it's precisely that sort of top-level attention that's required to give confidence to the leaders of Azerbaijan and Armenia to take to their own people very controversial compromises, again, that had been preliminarily agreed. Now the question is, will that interest be sustained? I mean, because the Armenian American community is so well organized and is vocal, especially in California, as you mentioned, I think that's, it was time for, or Secretary Pompeo thought it was time to exert some extra political muscle. I just hope they'll continue.
Mark, do you think the U.S. should even take a stance on this, or is this one of those, wars that Trump in particular said we don't need to be involved in any other foreign conflict in the first place?
Well, as we were talking about earlier, I actually think that we have a unique position here, that we can be the honest brokers since we really don't have a dog in the fight, much like Libya. We're in specifically a good position for Libya where we have allies on both sides. And because of that, we haven't taken sides. That's where we can be an honest broker. I don't necessarily think that at this point in the election cycle and a possible transition of administrations that we really have that kind of appetite in Washington, D.C., but they should be involved because this is where American diplomatic muscle of great ambassadors and former ambassadors like Matt Bryza can make a real difference.
Right. Mark, you mentioned Libya, for example. I mean, where else would Turkey kind of seek support from the United States?
Well, look, let's be clear. The relationships with Greece right now and the Mediterranean issues right now are not working well for anybody in that situation, particularly as far as NATO is involved. The United States can actually be the leader in NATO to try to find a resolution among all the parties because NATO is stronger at 27 than it is at 26 or at 25.
Matthew, let me get your take on that. I mean, where should Turkey be actually pushing the United States to take a stand?
Well, I mean, I agree with General Kimmitt, by the way, that there's not a lot of appetite in Washington now to get deeply involved in Nagorno-Karabakh. But since we were talking about it, I think the way to wrap up that war right now, or the military phase, is to give President Aliyev political cover, to rein in nationalism that's kind of propelling things forward now. I think Azerbaijan is very close to a strategic victory by recapturing one key city called Shusha. And now would be a good time to wind down the military phase and go to the diplomatic phase. So that's one area. I would like to see in Washington, a more balanced and sustained approach on Libya. I agree with General Kimmitt that the U.S. Doesn't really have a dog in that fight. But there is a UN recognized government in Tripoli, and that's the one Turkey has supported. And I wish the United States and the rest of NATO would also recognize that in northwest Syria, in Idlib, it's actually Turkish military operations that fought Russian forces and Assad's forces to a halt. And have saved maybe thousands or tens of thousands of civilian lives. Finally, I think the U.S. should be working together with Turkey in the Black Sea, where Turkey now has just reached a landmark agreement with Ukraine on military technology development. And there's been a real need over the last few years to kind of rein in Russia's ambitions in the Black Sea, where it has expanded its capabilities dramatically after invading Ukraine, invading Georgia, annexing Crimea.
Right. Okay. Ambassador, I'm going to stay with you because I want to ask, actually, I want to get your opinion on, Trump's Middle East peace plan, especially if that is the plan going forward post this election. Some feel it rallied the Arab world. Others feel it's further divided the Arab world. Let me just get your opinion on it. And where Turkey obviously feels it completely alienated and punished Palestinians unfairly. But where do you see that plan, the once so-called deal of the century, going?
Yeah, and there are two components of President Trump's Middle East policy with regard to Israel now, right? So that plan, it's just as you said, it's seen certainly by the Palestinians and by many other friends of Palestine like Turkey as being tilted dramatically toward Israel. I think the Trump administration, though, is going to keep pushing it, just like the so-called Abraham Accords. I mean, President Trump did engineer some diplomatic breakthroughs with regard to Israel, right? With Israel now getting on track to restore its relations with the UAE, with Bahrain. President Trump said yesterday there are like 10 more Muslim-majority countries kind of in line to normalize relations with Israel. That's an important part of the peace plan, even though it's not formally written into the plan, because in the past, U.S. policy had been, we won't support any Arab country or Muslim-majority country's normalization of relations with Israel unless there's a breakthrough on a peace plan that would be a two-state solution that's satisfactory to the Palestinians. So I think a second Trump administration would just barrel ahead, just as they have been at the end of the administration.
Okay. Matthew Bryza, and Mark Kimmitt. Thank you both so much for joining us. We're going to see you, of course, in the minutes and hours to come for further analysis. Thanks so much to you both.